The day had started like any other. David returned home early from a business trip, exhausted but looking forward to surprising his wife, Rachel. He had left 2 days ago, trusting everything at home was as it should be. But as he parked his car in the driveway, an unsettling feeling crept over him. Something felt off. He stepped inside the house and noticed the silence. No TV, no music, just the faint sound of muffled voices upstairs. David froze. Rachel didn't know he was coming home early, and she rarely invited anyone over without telling him. He quietly shut the front door and set his bag down, his heart beginning to race. He climbed the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky steps. The voices became clearer. A man's voice, low and casual, and Rachel's unmistakable laugh. David stopped outside the bedroom door, his hand hovering over the handle. His mind raced with excuses, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was innocent. But when he pushed the door open, the scene that greeted him shattered any hope of innocence. Rachel and his lawyer, Mark, were in bed together, their laughter dying instantly as they noticed him standing there. The shock on their faces mirrored the disbelief on his. "David!" Rachel scrambled to cover herself, her voice filled with panic. Mark froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. David's chest tightened as anger and humiliation coursed through him. "In my bed," he said, his voice low but deadly. "In our bed." Rachel stammered, "It's not what it looks like." David let out a bitter laugh, his fists clenched. "Not what it looks like? You're in my bed with my lawyer, and you think I'll believe anything you say?" Mark finally found his voice. "David, I can explain—" But David cut him off with a sharp glare. "Explain? What could you possibly explain, Mark? That you betrayed me? That you slept with my wife in the house I worked my entire life to build?" Rachel reached out toward him, tears streaming down her face. "David, please, just listen. Don't touch me," he snapped, stepping back. His mind reeled as he looked at the two of them, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. Mark, the man he trusted with his legal affairs, and Rachel, the woman he had loved for over a decade. David didn't wait for another excuse. He turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, and for the first time, he noticed how empty it felt. He grabbed his car keys and left without looking back. His heart pounded as he drove aimlessly, his mind replaying the scene over and over. How long had this been going on? How many times had they laughed at him behind his back? The humiliation was unbearable, but beneath it all, anger burned. David knew one thing as he gripped the steering wheel. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. They had crossed a line, and they would regret it. David parked his car on the side of a quiet road, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His mind was a storm of emotions: betrayal, anger, humiliation. But more than anything, he felt hollow. The image of Rachel and Mark together in his bed was burned into his memory, a wound that seemed to grow deeper with each passing second. He stared out at the empty street, struggling to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. He thought about all the years he had spent building their life together. He had worked long hours, sacrificing weekends and holidays to provide Rachel with everything she wanted. The house, the vacations, the stability. It had all been for her. For them. And this was how she repaid him. His mind turned to Mark, the man he had trusted with some of the most important parts of his life. Mark had been more than a lawyer. He had been a confidant, someone David relied on when things got complicated. And now, it seemed, Mark had been using that trust to betray him in the worst possible way. David closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat. He wanted to scream, to cry, to punch something, but he refused to let himself break. He wasn't a weak man. He had built everything in his life through hard work and determination, and he wasn't going to let two selfish people destroy him. Instead, he thought about Rachel's face when he caught them. The panic, the fear. It was the look of someone who knew she had been caught. And Mark? Mark had looked like a coward, frozen in place, unable to even defend himself. They thought they had the upper hand, that David would walk away defeated. But they were wrong. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for James, his closest friend. James was the one person David trusted completely, someone who always gave him straightforward advice. "James," David said when his friend picked up. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "I need your help." "What's going on?" James asked, concern immediately evident in his tone. David hesitated for a moment before saying the words out loud. "Rachel's been cheating on me." "With Mark." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Mark? Your lawyer? Are you serious?" "I wish I wasn't," David said bitterly. "I walked in on them. In my bed." James cursed under his breath. "That's low, even for someone like Mark. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make them regret it," David said, his voice cold and resolute. "But I need to be smart about this. I can't let anger cloud my judgment. I need to plan." "You know I've got your back," James said firmly. "Whatever you need, I'm here." David nodded, even though James couldn't see him. "Thanks. I'm going to take some time to figure out my next move. But I promise you, they're not getting away with this." After hanging up, David sat in silence for a while, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't confront them again. Not yet. He needed to gather evidence, to make sure that when he struck, it would be devastating. He wasn't just going to punish them. He was going to destroy them. With renewed focus, David started his car and headed back toward the house. He wasn't ready to face Rachel yet, but he needed to act quickly. The first step in his plan was simple: gather as much information as possible. He would uncover every lie, every secret, and use it to his advantage. As he pulled into the driveway, David's jaw tightened. The house, once a symbol of everything he had worked for, now felt like a prison. But he refused to let it break him. This was just the beginning. David entered the house late that night, the quiet pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Rachel had left the bedroom light on, but the door was closed. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her excuses. Instead, he went straight to his study, locking the door behind him. Sitting at his desk, David pulled out his laptop. He opened their joint bank accounts, credit card statements, and email logs. If Rachel and Mark thought they could hide their betrayal, they were wrong. David wasn't just hurt. He was determined. He would find every detail, every clue, and use it against them. The first thing he noticed was a series of withdrawals from their savings account over the past 6 months. They weren't massive amounts, but frequent enough to raise suspicion. There were also charges for luxury items he didn't recognize, expensive dinners, hotel stays, and even jewelry he had never seen Rachel wear. David's hands tightened into fists as he stared at the screen. She had been using his money to fund her affair. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. Every dollar he had earned through hard work and sacrifice was being spent on another man. But David didn't stop there. He accessed their shared cloud account, searching for anything suspicious. It didn't take long to find messages between Rachel and Mark. The texts were casual on the surface, but the tone was unmistakable, intimate and full of shared secrets. One message in particular made David's blood run cold. It was from Mark, sent just a week ago. "We should talk about the house. If things go as planned, it'll be ours soon." David read the message 3 times, each word hitting him like a blow. They weren't just having an affair, they were plotting against him. Mark, his trusted lawyer, had likely been feeding Rachel advice on how to take the house and other assets in a divorce. David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. They thought they were smart, that they had covered their tracks. But they had underestimated him. He wouldn't just expose them. He would make sure their plans backfired spectacularly. The next morning, David called James again, his voice calm but laced with purpose. "I need a private investigator, someone discreet and thorough." James didn't hesitate. "I'll make some calls." You're serious about this, aren't you? Dead serious, David replied. They've been planning this for months. I'm going to uncover everything, and when I do, they'll wish they had never crossed me. By the afternoon, David had hired a seasoned private investigator named Paul. The man was experienced, with a reputation for uncovering even the most well-hidden secrets. Start with Mark, David instructed during their meeting. I want to know everything: his finances, his past cases, his personal life. If he so much as jaywalked, I want it documented. Paul nodded, jotting down notes. And Rachel? Focus on her connections with Mark, David said. I want proof of the affair and anything else they've been hiding. Emails, meetings, financial transactions, leave nothing untouched. While Paul began his work, David started taking steps to protect himself. He met with another lawyer, one of the best in the city, explaining the situation in detail. Your first move should be to secure your assets, the lawyer advised. Freeze the joint accounts and transfer any personal funds into a separate account under your name. David followed the advice immediately. That evening, when Rachel tried to use her credit card to make an online purchase, she found it declined. She came into the study, her face flushed with confusion. David, the card isn't working, she said, standing in the doorway. He didn't look up from his laptop. I froze the accounts. Rachel's eyes widened. Why would you do that? David finally met her gaze, his expression cold. Why do you think? Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. She turned and left, the sound of her retreating footsteps echoing through the house. David felt a small surge of satisfaction. It was a start, a small taste of what was coming. Over the next few days, Paul delivered regular updates. The evidence against Mark and Rachel piled up. Phone records showing daily calls between them, receipts for gifts Mark had bought Rachel, and even surveillance footage of the two meeting at a luxury hotel. But the most damning discovery came a week later. Paul found that Mark had been advising Rachel on how to manipulate the divorce process to her advantage. Emails detailed his strategy to ensure Rachel got the house, a hefty settlement, and even a share of David's business. David clenched his jaw as he read the reports. The betrayal was deeper than he imagined, but he wasn't intimidated. If they wanted to play dirty, he would show them just how dangerous it was to underestimate him. The pieces were falling into place. Now it was time to plan his next move, a move that would leave both Rachel and Mark with nothing but regret. David's plan was simple but ruthless. He would let Rachel and Mark believe they were still in control, unaware of the net tightening around them. They thought he was oblivious, weak, and easily defeated, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The first step was ensuring they had no way to escape the consequences. David had already frozen their joint accounts and secured his personal finances. Now, he needed to make their betrayal public. He wanted everyone, friends, colleagues, and family, to know the truth, and he met with his lawyer again, armed with the evidence Paul had gathered. I want everything ready for court, David said, sliding the folder of incriminating documents across the desk. Emails, receipts, surveillance footage, it's all here. The lawyer glanced through the file, raising an eyebrow. This is airtight. If this goes to court, your wife and Mark won't stand a chance. David's lips curved into a cold smile. Good. But before we get there, I want to expose them in a way they'll never forget. The perfect opportunity. A week later, Rachel invited David to a dinner party hosted by one of their mutual friends. David knew it wasn't an olive branch. It was a calculated move to maintain appearances. Rachel was a master at manipulation, and she wanted to ensure no one suspected the truth. David played along, agreeing to attend with a calm demeanor that masked his simmering rage. He had no intention of letting the night pass quietly. On the day of the party, David received a final report from Paul. It contained everything he needed to destroy Mark's career and reputation. Mark had been involved in several unethical dealings with other clients, some of which bordered on outright fraud. Combined with the affair and the financial scheming, it was more than enough to end his career. That evening, David dressed sharply, choosing the same suit he wore the day he had signed the papers for their home, a reminder of everything he had built and everything they had tried to take from him. Rachel greeted him with a bright smile when he came downstairs, as if nothing had happened. "Ready to go?" she asked, her tone cheerful. "Of course," David said smoothly, offering her his arm. It was almost amusing how easily she fell back into her role, pretending everything was fine. The public exposure. The dinner party was held at a luxurious estate, filled with the kind of people who thrived on gossip and appearances. Rachel thrived in these settings, her charm and wit making her the center of attention. David stayed by her side, watching as she laughed and chatted with their friends, completely unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. Midway through the evening, as guests mingled with drinks in hand, David approached the host. "Would you mind if I made a small announcement?" he asked politely. The host smiled. "Of course, David. The floor is yours." David stepped to the center of the room, holding up his glass to get everyone's attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. Rachel stood nearby, her smile faltering slightly as she sensed the shift in his tone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," David began, his voice steady and commanding. "I wanted to take a moment to share something important, something personal." The room grew still, the air thick with curiosity. "For the past few months, I've been dealing with something I never thought I'd have to face," David continued. "Betrayal. Betrayal from the two people I trusted the most, my wife and my lawyer." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Rachel's face turned ghostly pale. She took a step forward, stammering, "David, what are you—" "Don't," David said sharply, cutting her off. "You've had your chance to speak, now it's my turn." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, handing it to the host. "Play this, please." The host hesitated, then inserted the drive into the large TV mounted on the wall. The screen lit up, displaying a series of images and videos. Rachel and Mark entering a hotel together, receipts for expensive gifts and dinners, screenshots of their messages, including the one about taking the house. The room erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs as the evidence played out. Rachel looked around desperately, her carefully constructed mask crumbling. David's voice cut through the noise. "For those of you wondering, Mark wasn't just my lawyer. He was also Rachel's lover. Together, they conspired to betray me, steal my home, and destroy everything I've worked for." He turned to Rachel, his gaze cold. "You thought you could outsmart me. You thought I wouldn't find out. But you forgot one thing. I've always been 2 steps ahead." Rachel tried to speak, but no words came. The weight of the truth was too heavy. David looked at Mark, who stood frozen near the back of the room, his face pale. "And you," David said, his voice filled with disdain. "You betrayed not just me, but every client who trusted you. By the time I'm done, you'll never work in this town again." As the footage ended, the room was silent except for the sound of Rachel's uneven breathing. David raised his glass one final time. "To betrayal," he said mockingly. "May it always come with consequences." He walked out of the room, leaving Rachel and Mark to face the judgment of their peers. For David, the real revenge was just beginning. The aftermath of the dinner party was exactly as David had planned. Rachel and Mark's betrayal became the talk of their social circle, spreading like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew the full extent of their deception, and neither Rachel nor Mark could escape the tidal wave of shame. Rachel tried to reach David multiple times, but he ignored her calls and messages. Her voicemails were filled with pleas and excuses, each one more desperate than the last. "David, please, we need to talk. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." But David wasn't interested in fixing anything. He had already started the legal proceedings for divorce, and with the overwhelming evidence against Rachel, she had no leverage. Mark's fall from Grace Mark's downfall was swift and brutal. David's lawyer filed a formal complaint with the Bar Association, detailing Mark's unethical behavior. The evidence of his affair with Rachel, combined with the fraudulent advice he had given her about taking David's assets, left no room for defense. Within weeks, Mark's license was suspended, and his clients abandoned him in droves. His once thriving practice collapsed, leaving him with nothing but regret and humiliation. David heard through mutual acquaintances that Mark had left town, unable to face the public disgrace. But for David, this wasn't enough. He wanted Mark to understand the full weight of his actions. Through his private investigator, David uncovered more of Mark's dirty dealings, hidden accounts, shady property deals, and a trail of clients he had cheated out of money. He forwarded everything to the authorities, ensuring Mark would face criminal charges. Rachel's new reality. Rachel, meanwhile, found herself isolated and shunned. The friends who had once admired her charm now whispered behind her back, their judgment cutting deeper than any insult. David made sure the divorce proceedings were as swift as possible. With the prenuptial agreement in place and evidence of her infidelity, Rachel walked away with nothing but her personal belongings. The house, the cars, and the savings all remained under David's control. Rachel moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the luxurious home she had once shared with David. She tried to maintain her dignity, but it was clear she was struggling. David knew this not because he wanted to gloat, but because she continued to contact him, begging for another chance. "David," one of her messages read, "I know I hurt you, but I've realized how much you mean to me. Please, let's start over." David read the message with a calm detachment. The Rachel he had once loved no longer existed, replaced by someone who had betrayed his trust and taken his kindness for weakness. A moment of reflection. One evening, as David sat in his study reviewing the final divorce papers, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The betrayal had cut deep, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger, more determined to protect what he had built. He thought about the moment he had walked in on Rachel and Mark. At the time, he had felt like his world was falling apart. But now he saw it for what it was, a necessary revelation. Their betrayal had exposed their true characters, and in doing so, had freed him from a life built on lies. As he signed the final documents, David felt a sense of closure. The past was behind him, and he was ready to move forward. With the divorce finalized and the weight of betrayal lifted, David shifted his focus to rebuilding his life. He wasn't just content with moving on, he wanted to thrive, to ensure that Rachel and Mark saw the strength they could never destroy. David moved into a sleek penthouse overlooking the city, a space that symbolized his new beginning. The minimalist design and floor-to-ceiling windows reflected his clarity of purpose. This wasn't just a home, it was a statement of his independence and resilience. Mark's final blow. David had ensured that Mark's professional life was in ruins, but there was one final step to seal his fate. Through his investigator, David uncovered a series of fraudulent real estate transactions that Mark had tried to bury. These weren't just unethical, they were illegal. David anonymously sent the evidence to the local authorities, ensuring that Mark's misdeeds couldn't be ignored. Within weeks, Mark was arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. The once confident lawyer was now a disgraced criminal, his name synonymous with dishonor. News of Mark's downfall spread quickly, and David couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Mark had thought he could outsmart him, but David had proved that betrayal came with a price. Rachel's struggles. Rachel's life had taken a drastic turn. Without access to the lavish lifestyle David had provided, she was forced to take a job as a receptionist at a small law firm. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry were long gone, sold to pay for her mounting bills. David occasionally heard about her struggles through mutual friends. She was no longer the confident, charming woman who had thrived in social circles. Now she was a shadow of her former self, consumed by regret and bitterness. Despite her repeated attempts to reach out to David, he never responded. Her calls went unanswered, her messages deleted without a second thought. For David, Rachel's pleas were a reminder of the life he had left behind, a life he had no intention of revisiting. A new purpose. David threw himself into his work, expanding his business with a renewed sense of purpose. His success wasn't just professional, it was personal. Every deal he closed, every milestone he achieved, was a testament to his resilience, but it wasn't all work. David began reconnecting with old friends, people he had lost touch with during his marriage. He found joy in simple things, dinners with friends, long drives, and moments of solitude where he could reflect on how far he had come. The unexpected twist. One afternoon, David received a letter. It wasn't from Rachel or Mark, but from someone unexpected, Mark's former client, a woman named Linda. The letter detailed how Mark had defrauded her out of a large sum of money, leaving her in financial ruin. Linda thanked David for exposing Mark, explaining that his actions had given her the courage to come forward. She included a simple but powerful message. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best beginnings. Thank you for fighting back. David folded the letter carefully, placing it in his desk drawer. It was a reminder that his actions had far-reaching consequences, not just for Rachel and Mark, but for others who had been wronged. A final toast. One evening, David stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, a glass of scotch in hand. The city lights glittered below, a reminder of the life he had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. He thought about everything he had endured, the lies, the pain, the humiliation. But instead of anger, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. He had faced the worst and come out stronger. Lifting his glass, David made a silent toast to himself, to strength, to resilience, to the life he had reclaimed. And as the night stretched before him, he knew one thing for certain. He was finally free. As time passed, the storm of betrayal that had once consumed David began to fade. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of his strength and resilience, proof that even in the face of the deepest betrayal, he could rise above. Rachel's final plea one rainy evening, David received an unexpected knock at his door. Opening it, he found Rachel standing there, drenched and visibly shaken. Her once perfect appearance was gone, replaced by the look of someone who had hit rock bottom. "David," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk to you." David didn't step aside to let her in. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Rachel?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I made a terrible mistake. I lost everything, my home, my friends, my dignity. I know I hurt you, but I've changed. I just want a chance to make things right." David studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. He thought about the countless nights he had spent questioning himself, wondering what he had done to deserve her betrayal. And now, here she was, asking for forgiveness. "You want forgiveness?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "For lying to me? For using me? For plotting with someone I trusted to take everything I worked for?" Rachel's shoulders sagged under the weight of his words. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I got caught up in greed and selfishness," David interrupted. "You didn't just betray me, Rachel. You betrayed yourself. And now you're paying the price for it." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then her expression crumbled. "I just want to fix things, David. Please." David shook his head slowly. "Some things can't be fixed. Actions have consequences, Rachel. You taught me that. Now it's your turn to live with them." With that, he closed the door, leaving her standing alone in the rain. A new beginning. David's life continued to flourish. His business expanded into new markets, and he began mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing the lessons he had learned, not just about business, but about resilience and integrity. One day, while walking through a park, David stopped to watch a group of children playing. Their laughter and energy reminded him of simpler times, before betrayal had hardened him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope, a belief that his future could be about more than just rebuilding. It could be about rediscovering joy. Rachel and Mark's fates. Mark's legal troubles escalated, and he was eventually sentenced to prison for fraud and embezzlement. The once respected lawyer now faced years behind bars, his reputation forever tarnished. Rachel, on the other hand, struggled to find stability. Without the support of her social circle or the financial safety net she had once enjoyed, she bounced from one low-paying job to another. The life she had so carefully constructed had crumbled, leaving her with nothing but regret. The Arbiter of Redemption. Months later, David received another letter, this time from someone he hadn't expected, Rachel. In it, she wrote, "David, I've spent every day since our divorce thinking about what I did to you. I realize now how much I took for granted and how deeply I hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I ruined it. I'm sorry." David read the letter twice before folding it and placing it in a drawer. He didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet acceptance. He had moved on, and so had his life. The final chapter one evening, as David stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the sun set over the city, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The betrayal, the pain, the revenge, it had all shaped him into the man he was now. Lifting a glass of wine, he toasted to his reflection in the window, not to revenge or even to justice, but to freedom, the freedom to live a life unburdened by the past. As the city lights blinked to life below, David smiled for the first time in a long time. The chapter was closed, and the story of his new beginning was just beginning to be written.